Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Takes a few seconds or 30 seconds or so for the attendees to populate in. So we're going to do a little housekeeping here. We have a special guest today, as you've seen in the invitation. But before I introduce everybody, I'm going to do a little housekeeping. You're most welcome, and we encourage active questions throughout our chat. There won't be a presentation formally here today. We're going to be doing a roundtable discussion that will be headed and moderated by Hamlet and myself, mostly Hamlet. And we're going to talk about things that I think are important to all of us. And so, again, welcome for everybody being here. Please feel free to ask questions in either the Q&A by raising your hand, and we'll type them up and pay attention to them, as well as the chat box. I have a little anecdotal story. I met Hamlet, and when I reflect back on it now, it was about 1.5 years ago, I think, and all kinds of interesting facts. We're meeting in a basement of a restaurant that was quite elegant, but by the end of the dinner, I felt like I was in a bunker with a bunch of operatives, and not having any public service myself. I learned a ton that night, including meeting a lot of interesting people, and it happened to be in our dear friend Scaramucci's restaurant. And I called him to say I met somebody of note in his restaurant that evening, and he rang me back immediately and said, "How's the food?" So, this was a fun time, and thank you for having me there and start of our relationship, and welcome. So Hamlet has, let him do his bio, but he has a very interesting background. He is involved in a fund that is one of the reasons why the subject matter is relevant today. It's a focus of the fund and investing in companies that do the sort of things you're going to hear about today. But even though we're interested in talking about what Hamlet's doing with the fund, the topic today is talking about what I call national security issues that are relevant to all of us. And we have some really interesting people that I hope you enjoy, and we welcome them all. Hamlet, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, Arthur, appreciate the opportunity here to present a subject and a topic that I think is near and dear to my heart. I can talk on and on for hours upon this because it's pretty important to me. But we decided to do something a little different. I know most of the people within the Family Office Insight Network are used to hearing pitches from funds and companies. What we wanted to do is give you all something different, which is an insight and a look into an asset class and an ecosystem that most people don't really understand. And folks who follow it usually follow it on the margins, because you need to have some pretty good reach into the various different networks to get a good understanding of what this ecosystem looks like. And what we're talking about here specifically is investing around the area of national security and defense. It's an area that's near and dear to my heart. I grew up in the private sector, spent a good chunk of my adult life there. Had a good fortune of working in the national security space for the federal government for I'll call it the second third or the second half of my adult life, and got a chance to meet some very interesting folks. And upon getting out, I had a lot of different things I wanted to do with my life, and through circumstance and Murphy, I got introduced to some very interesting folks, and that's what led us to stand up IRONGATE Capital Advisors. We're a venture fund co-investment platform. What we do is we deploy capital into cutting-edge technologies that have a direct application in the national security and defense arena. The way we do it is really leveraging what we're good at, which is our people and our access. We have, I think, a very unique set of folks that are directly associated with us, that are part of our management team and our advisory board. These are folks that have active security clearances, have worked in the federal government, specifically in the national security and defense arena. And we also have an extended network of people that we're close friends with, who we regularly will converse and talk about what's broken, what's needed around national security and defense. So I think we're uniquely positioned to leverage that access, to get access to proprietary deal flow in two areas that I think are very hard for the average investor family office to get into. And that's the areas around or the deal flow that happens in the halls of DC, specifically around the DoD and the intelligence community, and some of the private deals that are traded around Silicon Valley. But I think what we've built is a network that allows us to access that pipeline of deal flow. And as far as why we're doing this, we're shameless capitalists, so we want to make as much money as we can for our investors, but we're doing this because of a sense of mission. And that's what this call is really about, is to help educate and enlighten the Family Office Insights Network on the importance of what it is and what we're doing, why we're doing it. And then for those that are interested in hearing more, I'll be more than happy to set up a follow-up call to really dive into the details of who we are, our structure, and what we're doing. But having said that, want to lead a panel discussion here with two of our fellow guests, David Hartford and Carl Wagner. I'll let them each of them go into their brief bios. I think you guys have the long form bio, and then from there, I think we'll jump into this. We'll go through a panel discussion on what's happening geopolitically from a technology standpoint. And then what we'll do is obviously in typical roundtable fashion, get into some of the specifics of this ecosystem, why it matters, and show you some examples of technologies and issues that we're investing in and around. So having said that, we'll begin with David Hartford. He's part of our senior advisory board for IRONGATE. I've known David for several years, and I think David comes from the family office space. So David?
Well, I guess, I wanted to add a couple things about my background to put it into this context. So first of all, I started out life as an Army brat. So my first home was an Army barracks in North Carolina. And along the way, one of my first jobs was working with a small company called Rockwell International, dealing with some aerospace aspects of our government. And I also have invested in and worked with companies that have made both software and hardware components for DoD and IC activities. One thing I'm not even sure that Hamlet and I ever discussed was that I actually, as an attorney, I represented U.S. tech companies doing business with what at the time was the Soviet Union, and having to deal with all those kinds of aspects. So this is an area of interest to me because I've been living on the edges of it for many, many years and having to take into account the threats that we're dealing with. So we have a couple people that have much more direct and recent experience in those spaces. So I'm going to rely on them to bring us up to date on those, and then I'll interject later from a family office perspective, investor perspective.
Great. Cool. Thank you, David. Carl?
Yes, thanks, Hamlet. Great to see you, David. Carl Wagner, 29 years with the CIA. I retired in September of 2017 to start my second career. My last job at CIA was Chief of Counterintelligence Operations, which is the position that had insider threat underneath it, which basically just means that I was kind of there, had a front seat as we watched different types of cybersecurity technologies develop and to be applied to insider threats, which is something that we can talk about. We also had CFIUS issues under me. For those who don't know, this is Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Those who don't should start to know more about it because it affects many of your deals in ways that it hasn't in the past. It's a government framework that's been strengthened recently. So we can talk about that separately. In my second career, I formed a global security consulting company and did that for about a year. Then I received a call from Elon Musk and became the global security director at Tesla for a hot minute. A lot of fun, interesting experience, as you might imagine, a bit of a roller coaster, but really cool technology and a great company to work for and with. And since leaving there about a year ago, I've done more in venture capital, a bit of investing myself, and some advisory work for companies that are trying to open up a government revenue stream to diversify their revenues and to perhaps have a bit more of a stable, because the sales cycle is different, revenue picture, and also helping government try to bring in technologies in a more seamless and quick way, especially some of the kind of smaller niche technologies that have been very difficult in the past to bring in, given the kind of idiosyncratic and odd way in which the government is archaic, comes to mind, bureaucratic, structured, and it's getting better. So I've enjoyed doing that. Most recently, I founded a company called Confirmed by BuddyCheck. This is a really security in terms of health security, and that's something we can talk about as well. It's a mobile app that allows users to record, to verify with a medical professional, and display their COVID-19 status, so we can get back to work more quickly and smoothly in a data-driven approach. So that's a little bit on my background.
Great, cool. All right, let's jump in. Let's start with an issue that's near and dear to my heart. Anyone who's heard me present this thesis, make no bones about it, we've been very I think early and hawkish in terms of our view geopolitically, what's going to happen and what is happening. Our view has always been that we are probably in the opening stages, if not in a second Cold War. I would go so far as to say it's almost like an information Cold War or a third World War. But we're not looking at a battle where you're going to have columns of tanks marching against each other, but you are going to have a scenario where technology is going to be the key driver of who comes out ahead in this. And when we talk about technology and investing in national security and defense, we're not talking about investing in like guns and bullets and weapon systems. We're talking about investing in the hard tech that goes around that. So with that said, and Carl, maybe you and I can talk about what we're seeing in terms of the persistent threat that is coming towards us from China. I know in the last couple of years, even going back to the later years of the Obama administration, the consensus was moving from us having to deal with the counterterrorism issue as the most looming issue out there to the understanding that we are going back into a nation state position where it is China, it is Russia, more so China in terms of our pure adversaries. A term that's been thrown out there is the great competition between us and China, primarily as the two superpowers. In your role within the agency and some of the stuff you saw out in Silicon Valley, how would you encapsulate some of the examples of what kind of a threat or a challenge China poses? And when I say China, I'm very clear. I'm not talking about the Chinese people. I'm talking about a very subset of China, which is the Chinese Communist Party that is directing some of their resources towards us.
Yeah, first let me say, I'm not going to say anything classified. Obviously, we have a lifelong oath to protect classified information, but there's a lot that can be said. Second of all, I think it's important, and I know the listeners will understand this intuitively. There are many businesses that cannot thrive without China, right? So it may be great competition, it may be a new Cold War. I like to characterize it as a potentially a stormy or maybe even bad, maybe even failing marriage, but there's no way we can move out of the house, okay? We have to live in this house together. When I was at Tesla, for example, there's no way that Tesla will be successful without selling cars into the largest automobile market in the world, which is China, right? So one of the challenges is it's not China government always bad, US government always good. It's you have to be able to maintain two dichotomous things in your mind at the same time, which is they might be out to get you and your technology, but how do you work with them, okay? And anybody who has a neighbor that they might have a contentious relationship with would understand that you have to figure out a way to move forward. You know, there are neighborhood issues you've got to deal with. Doesn't mean you have to be best friends. It doesn't mean you invite them in your house and let them run through your wallet or get on your computer, right? So we need to be able to maintain this dichotomy and move forward smartly. That requires you to educate yourself. And one of the key foundational pieces here that is not intuitive to Americans or folks who grew up in a democratic society is that the decks are stacked in the government's favor in that system, right? Because they have all the tools at their disposal, and therefore, you know, we can talk about what the kind of values they're projecting through their kind of mercantilist approach. But at a very base level for folks who are investors, that it's not fair. Okay, they are subsidizing and you know, currying favor in ways that stack the decks against you from an investment standpoint. So we need to be smart about that. And luckily, the U.S. government is waking up. And so to the extent that we can forge a better and closer relationship, government to private sector, which is something I've been working on for the last 10 years or so, both towards the end of my time at the agency and my time as a private citizen and businessman, the better for all of us, to even the odds, and also to hopefully project values that are more representative of what we want the world to look like, which might not be ubiquitous surveillance and somebody tracking every move you make. It might not be somebody putting out disinformation, right? It's not for me, for sure. And so how do we make that happen? We're aware of it to begin with. We forge this relationship, and we can talk about the way in which I believe Silicon Valley is maturing and understanding its policy role, and the way in which DC is also maturing and understanding Silicon Valley and starting to try to forge bonds through these incubators. But it's on us, I think, for the private capital to team up with government, make a lot of money in the process, because a lot of these technologies that the Chinese government specifically, but others as well, are promoting, are ones that will make a lot of money, that are driving everything going forward. And we have to have this kind of whole of society approach, I think, in order to be successful, both as investors as well as a country.
Great points right there. Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen is when it comes to innovation, and it comes to technology, whether it's innovation that's happening at a Cisco or a T-Mobile, or that's happening at JPL or Cal State. One of the things that there's been plenty of, I think, press reporting on, and we're hearing some of these same echoes from government, is a persistent challenge, because some of that intellectual property has been circumvented, basically, and stolen, particularly by the Chinese over the last 15, 20 years. And this is a problem that I think we're just now waking up and starting to realize and need to address. But the big question is, well, so what? What does that mean? I think it was the former head of NSA, General Alexander, made a comment that when you try to capture the amount of intellectual property theft that came out of academia and industry, it equates to one of the single biggest wealth transfers in history. So if you think about it, we use Lockheed Martin as an example, and they've spent countless amount of man hours and dollars developing the F-35 fighter. Took how many years and how many billions of dollars of R&D for that company to get to the position where they can launch that airplane. There's reports, obviously, of the Chinese mocking up or knocking off that same device or that same fighter through a series of hacks into our supply chain or into Lockheed Martin's supply chain. Well, now they're able to develop that same thing at a fraction of the cost. So what does that impact from a GDP standpoint? So when you ask the question of why this matters, this is why it matters. If you're an early stage technology company, or if you're a late stage enterprise, your IP is king. And if that IP is walking out your coffers, whether it's through a purposeful hack or through a bad actor, that obviously impacts the bottom line. There's a lot of questions around Huawei, for example. I remember 15, 20 years ago, Huawei was an up-and-coming little company out of China no one really heard of, but there were some key IP issues around T-Mobile and Cisco, and a lot of speculation that IP basically went into being the foundation of what Huawei built their company on. And I think, Carl, as you mentioned, through subsidized dollars from the Chinese government, was able to create a series of mousetraps in the tech space that were cheaper and mimicked and knocked off some key competitors. And what does that market share translate to? So this technology arms race that we're in right now, and this is where David and Carl, welcome both of y'all to comment on this one. Traditionally, when people have thought about innovation and technology, that was basically the space of DARPA, Lockheed Martin, you mentioned Rockwell, Raytheon, Boeing, the defense primes, and that's it. How are you all seeing that change, where it's no longer just the primes, but it is the startup community that's taken a greater role in that space?
Well, I'll take a little bit on that one, because one of the things that people seem to forget is that DARPA was one of the reasons that Silicon Valley exists. So if you go back to the origins of Silicon Valley, it was spun out of Fairchild Semi, and a lot of the things that happened after that were financed by DARPA, and because the U.S. government recognized that the technology that was coming out of here was going to drive innovation within the government. We lost a lot of that. And particularly within the venture capital community, there were a lot of people that backed off from government. What we're seeing now, and I'm seeing in particular, is that there are a lot more people that are interested, as Carl alluded to, where you have dual use technologies. And the companies are looking for making nicer with the government, but they're running into problems in being able to establish a real communication. Because, as I put it, we have a very simple business because all you have to do is find the deals and do the right ones and build things to potential. But the problem is you have to start the entire process with due diligence. And, most of the guys and girls that are in this business don't have the Rolodex of people that they can call. And even if they did know who to call, what's the likelihood that they're going to get somebody to return the call and give them the information they need? And there's a lot of frustration in just being able to size the market and know whether it's something to put effort into.
Right.
But what is the good news is that there's a real attempt to learn that more. And as you and I know, there's more and more funds that are reaching out and trying to be able to offer technology to the U.S. government for critical functions. And that's a good part.
Yeah, I'd say that I think we've reached a tipping point where anybody who doubted before the need to delve into some of the more national security focused technologies, or and just take cybersecurity for example. You can't claim that there's not a huge market potential there now, given kind of the geopolitics and what's happening. We're not going to get into politics, obviously, but this decoupling potentially from China, I don't think we can possibly decouple, as I mentioned in the beginning, but there is a decoupling discussion happening. And then just looking at the criminal hacks as well, putting China off to the side, I think that there's a rush to implement finally in a way that's concerted and aggressive that I've always wondered when this moment would happen. Best practices in cybersecurity, right? Like we haven't seen before. We've got ransomware attacks, data breaches, IP theft, theft of dollars, DDoS. All of this is just finally people are waking up and saying, okay, you've got all this. We're decoupling from China. We need to wake up. Every company now is a technology company. Why? Because they need to have cybersecurity in place to protect on the defense side. In the same way, every company is a payments company because the advanced ways in which payments to vendors are made affects every company. And so you see companies like, you'll see companies involved in very interesting and advanced fintech innovations that are not, you wouldn't imagine they're fintech companies. And so I would just argue that every company has to be a security company now, right? Because if you want to survive as a company, you need to protect yourself from the barbarians outside the gate, outside the wall, and you only do that by taking concerted effort looking at security. Yeah. And it's just going to become more and more important to do so as IoT becomes more prevalent. IoT is going to increase the attack surface against your enterprise by 10, if not more times than what it is now, to where you'll be able to actually get onto somebody's modem through some connected device that before no one would have ever thought about securing, right?
Hanley, can I ask a quick question
Sure.
for Carl? One subject back when you were talking about China, do you think, and this is an opinion and you can decline to answer it, do you think that we can operate within the construct of China and their philosophy in the way they operate and still maintain the values that we have, whether it's a business or a person or a country? I mean, oftentimes people say, well, I don't like the way it is, but I'm willing to operate the way it is. Do you think that's actually doable?
I think it depends on the industry, and I'll invite Hamlet also to chime in. I think we've seen what's happened to some companies as they compromise their values. It's a tough decision, and it's not a decision you make once. It's an iterative process where you have to, recognize where your comfort level is and reassess constantly. I do think it's I'm still a believer now. I was in China. I was working for the CIA, but I was in China I don't want to give too much detail, but in a position in the embassy that gave me a front row seat to the negotiations around WTO and China's accession to it. We all thought that China would moderate over time and become like us. We were wrong. It's okay. It's okay to be wrong, but now it's important to wake up and to do something differently. We can't take a completely accommodative approach like we have in the past. We have to realize that we need to have a different approach. At the same time, it can't be necessarily to wall ourselves off completely. So I know that's not really a very exact answer, but I would say for companies that are engaged with and in China, you've got to protect your IP at all costs, no matter what it takes. And if that means you leave China or you don't enter the market, fine. If you're okay losing your IP over time because you think that you're going to achieve that exponential growth before they take the IP and do something else with it to compete against you, that's your calculus. But I think that has to be part of the calculus, what your values are and whether taking a more accommodative approach to China will violate those values, and kind of what your plans are elsewhere, in my opinion. Hamlet, you might want to add something.
That's a good point. I think I actually like your metaphor earlier as far as China being a neighbor. You may not like a neighbor, you not want to hang out your neighbor, but you're limited in terms of what you can do. You're kind of stuck with them. And I do believe because the size of the population, China's not going anywhere. They are 100%, I think right now, in terms of the Chinese government, an adversary of ours. Probably not as hostile as it was in Cold War 1.0, but Cold War 2.0 is sure shaping up to be pretty cantankerous, and we got to find a way where we can work together. I think with tech specifically, and it's been interesting to watch COVID impact both markets. One of the things you saw going back as late or as early as January and February was how the Chinese were or are even to this day using their dominance in key technologies like artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and ubiquitous surveillance of their own citizenry. I don't want to say go so far as saying running a draconian state, but having a really tight lid on what the people can and cannot do, and that's just it's part of their DNA. We have those same technologies here, whether it's facial recognition, whether it's tracking and monitoring from a data analytics standpoint or ad tech. We have some of those same capabilities, and what you're seeing is that's not what's happening. We're not using drones to lock down neighborhoods and buildings. We're not using technology to completely shutter movement throughout the entire city. What you are seeing now is, I think, Silicon Valley go through that thinking and knowledge process of, okay, I have this tech, how do I deploy that tech in a, I don't want to say altruistic, as a capitalist, how do I deploy that tech where I can make a lot of money but also not jeopardize society? And I'll use a couple of examples. One, Carl, you can probably talk about what you guys are working on, but we have a facial recognition company that we're LPs in right now that is using their facial recognition technology, and actually, it's a small world, working with you Carl, to find ways where how do you get the populace back to work? How do you get us to the point where we can very clearly and efficiently see whether we're positive or negative from a COVID standpoint, and we can walk into a building or we can walk into an office and get back to work? So we're trying to use that technology for the positive versus being draconian with it.
I think this is a good example. So in China, they've got, and I can't remember the name of it specifically, but you get a green, yellow, or red light as to whether you can go in or not based on your COVID testing status. We've created an app that is an opt-in app, right? Presuming people want to get back to their lives. You want to go to the restaurant down the street that you used to go to. You want to get back to the factory. It's opt-in, and you can choose to share your data on a day-by-day basis. But I'm not going to give aggregated access, at least it's not our intent from the beginning, to an employer. I've already had an employer ask, so surely you're going to give me aggregated access to all my employees' test status, right? And I said, no, they're going to give it to you one by one as they come through your door. if you want to aggregate it, then I'll even help you aggregate it because they gave permission. But they're the ones that decided that. So that's the value difference. This is what this new generation expects. I think that I never thought I'd see it. Maybe I was discouraged after we were raked over the coals for Snowden. I'm not saying the government's never done anything wrong. I do think it's a lot less nefarious than some people, because I was there, than some people think. I was wondering when they would wake up to the fact that Google and Facebook are not really living up to the values that people think that they're espousing. Maybe their privacy policy changed over time, et cetera. And so now I think people have a bit more faith in the government than they do in the tech companies. It's fascinating. We're kind of an upstart small technology company, and I want to make sure that we're not acquired by a large company that's going to basically take our soul and crush it and turn it into something that I'm trying to avoid. But yeah. I think there are ways around this. It's all about your values, and we have the technology to, I think, to deploy in a way that is still true to our values. Anonymized. So we're going to give anonymized access of this test data if the users say it's okay, because there are different things you can opt into, to CDC. So that, for example, we might be able to do a study that says, gee, south side of Chicago, everybody there's a lot more people with antibodies there than elsewhere, which means we can get them back to work, and they're lower socioeconomic. There's a lot of sense to that because they got COVID because they're lower socioeconomic. They didn't have as many facilities to avoid it, but that means they have antibodies. So let's put them back to work. So we want to look at a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, maybe city by city, state by state, but in an anonymized fashion, so we're not violating people's privacy. Privacy versus security is huge. I think now health versus security is a flavor of that, is a subset of that, and that discussion is fascinating to watch. You have the contact tracing piece. We're not contact tracers ourselves. I'm enjoying watching that discussion because these are national discussions that have to happen along the way for folks to have a mature view of the pros and cons of any of these societal issues.
Yeah.
Well, if I can go back to what we were talking about on China as well, because I think there's something that we do need to point out here, is that the Chinese Communist Party is in charge of everything that goes into a contract. And if they decide that they don't like a term in a contract, they can abrogate it. So it's a risk that you need to take into account whenever you're doing business with China. The other aspect is that I think it's pretty clear that China has decided that it wants to regain its preeminence in the world stage. And they're in a very good position to be able to do that, as was pointed out earlier. Because of the Communist Party, they actually have industrial policies. They have priorities that they put all of their resources behind. And we have industries that are at grave risk because they've decided that their resources are going to go focus totally in these particular arenas. And we're talking about AI, we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about drones, computing, a number of elements which we know that they have targeted. And I don't want to get into philosophy and history, but you can read about Thucydides' trap, about when you have an up-and-coming nation state taking over or overtaking the development of the present leader in a particular space or a particular geography or the world. And we're facing that. And we need to recognize that there are risks and there are mines all along this that we have to take into account whenever we're dealing with our investments, and our government has to take into account when they're dealing with policies. And I'd throw in a couple more elements too. We talked about China to some degree and Russia, but don't forget we also have Iran and we have North Korea to deal with as well. So it can get kind of scary out there whenever you're talking about where am I going to be investing and how am I going to invest to make money, but also make sure that the company itself is going to survive long term. Yeah.
There's an old adage that says there's profits to be made in war. I do think we are in a bit of a war footing right now with our peer adversaries. But I don't think the profits are to be made in guns and bullets. I think there's significant technologies that are being developed right now that are going to have a significant positive impact on society and the global economy. And also, I think you're going to make a difference from a national security and defense standpoint. So when we invest in tech and the technologies we're talking about here, and I think David touched on it earlier, we're talking about dual use technologies that make a significant impact when it comes to national security and defense, but also has a much greater utility and impact in the private sector and overall enterprise. I mean, this platform that we're talking on, the internet, Google Earth, the wheel, roads, some of our greatest breakthroughs in terms of healthcare and on autonomy and mobility. These are all technologies that came from advancements in the military industrial complex going all the way back to the Stone Age. So that's always been the norm, and I think it's going to continue to be the norm here in the 21st century. But I think that innovation arms race is going to be around hard tech. I mean, don't quote me. Both Xi and Putin are on record as saying that whatever country gets the position of dominance in key core technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and hypersonics is going to dictate geopolitics in the 21st century. They're not. This isn't an original thought by either one of those. We did the same thing in the 20th century. If you go back to the 20th century, we woke up one day to the Sputnik moment and realized that the Russians were a couple of leaps and bounds ahead of us when it came to the space race. And we put pedal to the metal, and we mobilized the military industrial complex, and we won the Cold War in the 20th century because we had better technology when it came to the space, computing power, and rocketry. 21st century is the same thing, except those technologies I think have evolved, and it is those things we talked about. It is artificial intelligence and data analytics. It is the area of hypersonics and eventually quantum computing. And I do think that innovation is not going to come from the federal governments. The landscape has changed significantly. That's why I think in my time in government and also my time here at IronGate, what we've seen over the last several years as we've built the strategy and begun to execute it is every other month I'm getting a different email from a different alumni from the special operations community or from NSA or CIA or the DoD or the DOE who's developing a new platform or a new tech or a new fund to address this gap and address this issue. You're starting to see more accelerators and incubators and innovation cells and areas and agencies that are appended to the federal government pop out with the sole focus on engaging private capital and venture. The issue there, though, is neither side knows the other. Neither side understands the culture. Neither side understands the language of being in the private sector or being in government. So I think there's an opportunity there to act as an intermediary, basically, helping private capital, helping venture, helping entrepreneurs understand the opportunities of where to begin to invest in a federal ecosystem. And then if you're NSA, CIA, DOD, InQtel, DIU, you name it, where to go within the venture and family office community, where there are pools of patriotic capital that want to invest and make a difference. And that's I think a big theme here. And we talked about it earlier with CFIUS. But for those of you not familiar with that acronym, that's an agency within the U.S. federal government that is now actively looking at deal flow, looking at cap stacks of and LPs of startups and venture funds to see who's involved in those companies, to make sure there isn't foreign capital, particularly Russian and Chinese money, coming into some of our core assets that are going into the federal government. So if you start blocking out foreign capital, well, guess who's got to fill that? It's U.S.-based capital, it's patriotic capital that, again, I don't think government is looking for a handout. Government isn't looking for grants and loan or forgivable loans. They're looking for capitalists who want to help build companies, reap the rewards financially, but also help contribute to the greater cause. So it's a pretty vibrant ecosystem we've seen developed. When we started our strategy several years ago, and we have a hybrid fund-to-fund strategy, we saw maybe a handful of funds that were core to our thesis. In the last 2 years, we've seen that number spike significantly, either through new fund formation or traditional Silicon Valley funds that are pivoting and moving into this space. So to me, I think that says that it's creating a lot of opportunity for private families and investors to get involved in this space. But you got to know who you're getting involved with, and I think you've got to invest with people who know what they're doing and who understand the network. Metaphorically, I'll use real estate as an example. Let's say I'm a family in New York, and I want to take advantage of the booming real estate in Florida or in Texas. How do I begin? Do I go on the ground? Do I develop the networks and contacts, or do I identify local partners who've got the city and the municipality wired so they know where to develop or where the developments are going, where to deploy capital? well, investing in venture and national security, I think, is no different. You're investing with known professionals who have the clearances, who have the network, who can help decipher the buying signals, who can decipher the demand signals coming out of the federal government, and then help make those introductions. So it's a fascinating space to get involved with. And I know, David, with your experience in Silicon Valley, I think you've seen that ecosystem ebb and flow, whether it's funds or private families. But welcome your thoughts in terms of what this opportunity really means for the family office network.
Well, I think the point is that family offices have always been in the forefront of getting behind the emerging managers and the emerging technologies. So it was only after the family offices and after the individual investors got involved in venture that the institutions drafted in afterwards. And I think what we have to face is we've been putting these threats and talking about the U.S. government dealing with them, but the reality is that the playing field is very different now. It's not government against government; it's government against private sector and public sector companies. And so all of the threats that are against the United States government from these other entities, exclusive of the things we have to deploy military resources on, are threats against the individual companies as well. So, you have to know what your supply chain looks like. You have to know where that supply chain breaks down. If we didn't recognize it before COVID, we sure as hell better now.
Oh, yeah.
So those technologies aren't any different in how they need to be applied for the private sector as opposed to government. And we need to get behind the companies that address those needs for the private sector as well as the public sector. And I think that's where I think the family office, particularly those that have experience in certain industries, understand that more than just purely financial investors.
Right.
And that's why I think we want to talk to the family offices more than anybody else, because they have the experience, they have the networks, they have the appreciation of the risks because they've lived them, and I think that's what's really important. But now now we see a lot more VCs waking up to that fact, but the dilemma, as you pointed out, is who do they talk to?
Right.
They know that those risks are there, but how do you get it into the government? And you and I have seen this on the other side, and I'm sure that Carl has as well. The government doesn't know who to talk to either. So there can be people within the Navy and within the Marines, and who do we talk to? We don't know who these people are. So there's a lot of outreach going from the government, but at the same time, I ran into a little bit of frustration on both sides when I was in a meeting between venture capitalists and some agency operatives. And the operatives had a wish list of 100 different things that they thought that they might want to have, but there were really only 3 things on the list that they were really interested in, but they couldn't tell anybody what they were. So that's where it really comes to down to, do you know who to talk to? Will they talk to you? Will they tell you the reality? Because there's not a common jargon between the two entities, and you need a translator in between.
Right.
I want to make just a couple of points. First, on the space race, I think it's interesting that if you look at the commercialization of space that's happening right now, and I'm involved in a space related company. It's a for-profit media company that's going to tell the story of some kids who are going to build a couple of lunar rovers, and we're sending them to the moon, and we're going to race them. It's a great example of the government is now looking to the private industry, and I don't think there's really anybody who's smart on this topic that doesn't support the commercialization of space and is seen, whether you like Elon Musk or not. SpaceX has done an incredible service to this industry and upended it and really kind of pushed for it to happen faster, cheaper, and better. Just to kind of drive home that point, Hamlet.
Yeah.
Hamlet, do you see questions there? You want to address one or more of those in the chat?
CFIUS, I can tell you that all the experts on CFIUS now, these law firms, who've been doing CFIUS all these years, there are new procedures and new precedents being set on not on a daily basis but on a weekly basis, and so all bets are off. But what is the case is that there's a much more thorough, all-encompassing approach to CFIUS, and will impact deals that it never impacted before. And so you're right to ask those questions, and I think it's important for you to think through intentionally as you make decisions about where you're investing, which LPs you're bringing on, et cetera, how you're doing the due diligence, and how that might impact from a CFIUS standpoint.
Yeah. I think CFIUS is also evolving where I think typical government, foreign money bad, CFIUS, all foreign money needs to be filtered out. To the pendulum is now swinging back and realizing, okay, not all foreign capital is bad. We've had some very productive conversations with some of our counterparts within the Five Eyes. Those are the traditional English-speaking countries that are very close allies of the United States, the Canadians, the Brits, the Kiwis and the Aussies, where we're starting to realize that we're all trying to work against some of the same problem sets. I mean, the Australians have a tremendous issue when it comes to China, and them being their chief partner from a minerals and from a commodities trading standpoint. To I mean, if you look at the Huawei discussions in the UK and what's affecting them there. So we're all addressing this, and we've come to realize that it's almost like the band that got together to fight the Cold War now needs to get back together to fight the second Cold War, where it comes to technology arms race we're in. So we're starting to see the Brits, the Canadians, and the Aussies and Kiwis doing some things that are similar to us. We need to cooperate with. Carl?
One little data point, I don't want to interrupt, but I don't want to lose the beat on this, and that is the U.S. government was less likely before to allow even, say, a Canadian majority interest in a national security technology, or in a company that's adjacent to a U.S. military base, or in a company that has access to personal information. Now that these other countries in this Five Eyes community are also developing and maturing in their own CFIUS frameworks, they don't call it CFIUS, they call it something else. Now the U.S. government is a little more willing to allow those deals to go through. Before, they were concerned that, well, this year, it's sold to Canada. Next year, it could be sold off to China, and then we don't have any control over that. So this kind of interaction and taking it one level of one order of magnitude up onto an international level with our partners is really good, I think, for the investment community, because it does allow you more flexibility like you might have had before when CFIUS wasn't really even an issue.
Yeah.
Hamlet, you there?
Yeah.
The discussion earlier was about how to access the right people.
Right.
If you're a company, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're an investor. In the evolution of what we're learning with COVID and supply chain and how disastrous it's been and may continue to be in terms of having stuff produced in China, for example, is if, for example, you're an investor in a company, or you're the entrepreneur and you have to pivot off of that, even though I hate that word, is there economic help from the government to help you transition out? And I'm not looking for gifts or maybe loans or something. Is that something that, for example, if you invested in a company or a fund that invested in a company like that, you could catalyze and help, which is one of the reasons why the fund is so valuable to the companies that you invest in, for example?
Yeah, that's probably, I think, traditionally going to impact more established operating companies that have a supply chain that's reliant on goods and manufacturing from China. From everything we've seen and heard, there is a concerted effort to provide a roadmap of how that would happen. I don't know the details of that. I do think that you're starting to see a concerted effort around the area of made in America, basically from a technology standpoint. And that's one of the things that has us, I think, very excited about this asset class. Is if you look at the companies that we're investing in, if you're investing in an emerging startup that's doing work for the federal government and for the national security ecosystem, then eventually wants to branch out in the private sector. You're investing in 2-3 people in a garage that's going to grow to a dozen people. It's going to grow to 100 people. Well, what is that? I mean, that's growing, high-paying, high-tech jobs here in the United States. So I think there's a significant job creation and re-education and retooling of the workforce. I think some of the more commoditized jobs that we've lost over the last 2 decades that have gone to China and elsewhere, I don't see those jobs coming back stateside. I see those jobs potentially coming back closer to the U.S. and other countries that are a little more friendly or a little more diversified. But the areas that we're investing in, I mean, these tech companies are all setting up here in the U.S. And what we're also starting to see is those tech companies aren't setting up in Silicon Valley anymore. More and more of these companies are starting to set up in Austin, in Florida, in Atlanta, in around the D.C. area, Denver, around Detroit, of all places.
Columbus, Ohio.
Columbus, Ohio, around Wright-Patterson. So there's a sense of fragmentation of where that innovation is happening. I actually think that's going to continue, especially when you look at what's happening over the last 6 months between COVID and the unrest in major urban cities. Nobody wants to live in a city anymore, and nobody needs to. We were at a private luncheon with Peter Thiel about 2 years ago. And these comments are very public now, but I mean, his thoughts were Silicon Valley's in trouble because a lot of the technologies that they're developing are enabling people to be entrepreneurs and not need to come to Silicon Valley and not need to pay a 50% premium because the company you're investing in needs to afford salaries that can pay exorbitant rents in Silicon Valley. So that innovation is popping up throughout the country right now. It's got us excited because those are
I would also say, Hamlet, that there's a bit of an echo chamber in Silicon Valley, and I say that with a bit of love in my heart for Silicon Valley, having been with Tesla, as well as dealt with domestic issues for the CIA for many years, that there's a bit of naivete and kind of inward lookingness that I think that these stovepipes are finally breaking down, these silos are breaking down, and people are realizing, wait, what did we just create?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What did we create? What impact did it have on society? Or why didn't what we created have the impact we thought it would? Yeah, it might have changed things for one class of society, but I'm a global citizen. I've lived overseas my whole life. I'm focused on sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of other places. Some of these have changed things for the better, and other technologies haven't had that impact. And so I'm glad to see those stovepipes breaking down, and for others to be able to get into the tech ecosystem, and for people here to have I'm sitting in San Jose as we speak, a more universal approach to what they're doing.
Yeah. No, things are changing. Like I said, we seemed like almost like outsiders 2 years ago when we were pounding the table on what was happening in China or with China. Specifically when it came to the issue of intellectual property theft from Silicon Valley, from our universities. So that's been a tremendous issue that I think you're starting to see the federal government and society as a whole wake up to it. The big thing right now, concern coming out of DC, is adversarial capital. Well, what does that mean? So if you're an early stage company that raised $5 million last year to build a widget that's going to do work for the DoD. Well, what happens because of COVID and the shock to the market and capital markets drying up and you're running out of money? Well, guess who's out there writing checks right now? It's Russia, it's China, it's people who want to take advantage of that opportunity to basically buy properties or buy IP on the cheap with the hope of diverting those dollars elsewhere. That's one of the things we want to absolutely address. And when COVID first hit, we were very cautiously optimistic because we thought that capital markets were going to get shocked for about 30, 45 days until we figured out what was happening. And we saw that. That shock may happen again with another sell-off going into the elections. But one of the things we were very confident was that if you're looking at investing in venture, in private equity, in private deals, we thought we were focusing on an asset class to a certain extent was protected. It was protected because the companies that are servicing this arena, 70-80% of their revenue streams are coming from the federal government or coming from big enterprise tech. We were on a partner call earlier today with one of our funds, and they basically addressed that, talking about how big enterprise and investing in tech coming from startup entrepreneurs is going to be a hot sector for the next several years. So as people kind of scratch their heads and trying to figure out what's happening with equity markets and debt and credit and real estate and tourism and consumer-facing companies, we're in an asset class that I think we're primed for success, because the federal government has been very vocal, particularly the DoD and the intelligence community, saying that we need to still support this tech ecosystem. We still need to support the startup community that is doing work on behalf of the Defense Department and the national security community. So I think we're in an area where our portfolio of companies and our funds are in pretty good shape. And we've had some good conversations with all of our fund managers and all of their investments. A lot of them are in good shape, and they're actually pretty constructive and pretty optimistic in terms of what they're working on, because they are working on cybersecurity solutions. They are working on platforms that enable people to work from home. They are working on AI technologies that help address COVID issues, or autonomous technologies that help advance our economy. So no asset class is completely protected, but I'm pretty confident in this area, in this segment, because I do think we are in the opening stages of what is going to be a golden era for innovation and technology and investing in that space, especially as it relates to national security, defense, and space.
So can we, Hamlet, talk? I hadn't really thought about this. It's an interesting question from our friends about the China funding the universities and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Just maybe a quick comment about that, and then I don't want to leave, if it's okay with you guys, until we talk about Iran and that sort of stuff too, and if it's okay.
Sure.
So the question is, can we talk about how China and funding many of our top universities' research grants, and as such, have a fair amount of access to our best and most valuable IP?
I mean, we've seen that. I'll kind of begin with what I've seen from an open source reporting standpoint. Carl, welcome to chime in, but I mean, that's been a big hot button. I think there was a professor that was just indicted this week from Harvard because of that and his affiliation with the Chinese government. It's hard to call it stealing technology from us when we've left the front door wide open, the keys to the register and the register open with all $100 bills nice and neatly stacked. So they basically come in and help themselves to it. But I think what you're starting to see is, from a policy and from just an awareness standpoint, using Carl's metaphor, we're now starting to lock our doors and hide our jewelry. So if the neighbor walks by, they're not sticking their nose in here. But it's a significant threat, because I mean, that's taxpayer dollars. Now, obviously on the academia side, it's not, but it's a serious issue. I mean, the reason this country is what it is today, and I'll speak to this directly as a first generation immigrant, and this ties into your next question, because I was born in Iran. But I think this country has always been built and improved because we're taking the brightest and best minds domestically and from abroad who are coming here and building companies and building on that innovation. And we got to find ways to make sure that innovation, that breakthrough, stays here and we monetize it here. I'm fine sharing with the free world, because I think rising tides lifts all ships. But as an American capitalist, I want to make sure that we benefit here first.
Yeah, and I would like to say that if you use the metaphor of somebody coming in and taking money out of the cash register, what if they took something that you didn't really think was of value, and then only when they took it and left and brought it back to their house did you realize, wow, that can be used for that? Yeah. That's really what's happening. So, and one example that I'm following is genetic information, right? So I've got a 23andMe account. I'm not that interesting. They told me I'm German and Irish. I knew that. And to watch out for skin cancer. That's okay. I'm happy that I did it. But that's PPI. That is the type of information that is and should be protected, and is kind of advanced level data that if you're in the genetics space and you're looking at the companies, you can see there's a lot of efforts afoot by the Chinese to go in there to buy the companies and the technologies and the information on all the individuals, right? So I think it behooves our universities and everybody involved in those ecosystems to try to think more holistically about what can these technologies be used for, realizing that you can't protect everything, because when you try to protect everything, you're protecting nothing. Yeah. And you can't stop science. There's some science that has to happen on the international front, and there's some science that's sensitive that probably should be happening simply on the national front. And revisiting that constantly so that we can make sure we're not giving it away, or at least allowing it to be taken away, is really important.
I'd like to chime in on that as well, because I think there's a danger of protecting ourselves against China on the academic side of things, because we've also been financing things in China and sending scientists to work there. So they are actually, particularly on the biotechnology front, are in an innovation wave within China itself, to the degree that they are now strengthening their own patent system, so that within China they will be able to more strongly protect things that are developed in China as innovations. So we can't close ourselves off from the kind of innovations that are going on there, but we have to recognize the risks from our side of sending people there, having people from there come here, and we need to identify earlier what are really critical national assets and make sure that we do fully protect them. But we also need access to the innovations that they're making, particularly when it comes to health. If they would be more open, that would be great. But it's clear that they are innovating, and we need access to their innovation almost as much as they need ours anymore. They've stolen enough that they can actually innovate now.
And then, Arthur, taking on your point in terms of Iran specifically, that's a thorny subject I'm pretty familiar with, because I've been following the Iran target since birth. But
let us have the raw stuff.
I think Iran is geopolitically, I think Iran is the Rosetta Stone. If we can fix Iran, we fix so many things, and they become a significant force multiplier against some other geopolitical issues. I think Iran has its own domestic issues it's going through right now. But Iran is not a backwards country by any means. They're a very advanced, very competent, very capable country. It's why when after the attack on Qasem Soleimani back in January, there was chatter coming from Iran saying if they retaliate, they're not going to retaliate in kind. They're going to retaliate in cyberspace. I mean, just Google Iran and JP Morgan or Iran and utility, and you'll see countless articles about how the Iranians have used their hacking prowess to basically launch sophisticated cyber attacks against us in the past. So China is by far the big gorilla in the room. I think North Korea, to a certain extent, has acted as a proxy by the Russians and the Chinese. They've probably gone over their skis a couple of times to do their own things. But Iran definitely has a capability to step up to the plate, especially in the cyber realm, to challenge us or to hurt us when need be. I don't think we're going to get into a serious shooting global conflict with Iran, and I hope we don't. I think cooler heads will hopefully prevail and we'll navigate through that. But again, that's warfare of the 21st century. Warfare of the 21st century is not going to be columns of tanks. It's not going to be Gulf War I. It's not going to be Gulf War II. It's not going to be Battle of the Bulge. It's going to be asymmetric warfare that's fought in the area of cyberspace, in the areas of covert influence or fake news or propaganda. And those are all things that are on the table. I mean, you look at the idea or the concept of propaganda. I mean, Trojan War was kind of that. I mean, it was a false flag operation that worked pretty well. So what's happening, I think, is with the onset of technology and the internet and where we're at today, it just becomes significantly easier and more efficient for countries to wage battle against each other in this cyber realm or the space realm. Now, when you look at if it does get kinetic and we do need to launch some sort of a kinetic strike, I think what you're starting to see is less and less of it is going to involve actual boots on the ground, and that's why autonomy and robotic systems and unmanned systems become such a critical area of focus, because we want to make sure we're at the leading edge of that. I do think this technology arms race, when it gets around the area of cyber, whether it's offensive and defensive or autonomous systems and command and control systems, we've got to take some of the same doctrine from the Reagan era and from the 20th century, and says he who has the biggest bomb or the biggest arsenal is going to win, because I'm never going to have to use it. And that's where we're at this point, where I think the other side needs to look at us and say, okay, you know what, I don't want to get into a conflict with these folks directly because they've got the resources and the means and technology to crush me. It's mutually agreed destruction. Well, if that's the known, then how do we get to the point of a mutual agreed resolution? And I think the only way you get there is peace through strength. We did it in the 20th century in terms of investments and cooperation with the defense community. I think the 21st century that landscape has changed, and I think we lose this arms race 100% if we don't motivate and if we don't recruit the venture community and the entrepreneurial community to get involved in this space. David alluded to it earlier. Chinese don't have a choice within their constitution or within their national laws. The Communist Party can commandeer or direct any private citizen or company to help advance the national security mission or advance the Chinese mission. Good luck doing that here in the U.S. Imagine if Washington, D.C. or Trump or whoever's president shows up and says, "Hey, you, Mr. Individual, I need you to do this."
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen. So I do believe in the power of capitalism. I do believe in the power of free markets. And I think if you unleash that, the 21st century as the 20th century will be a Western civilization, an American century. And I think the only way we do that is successfully and in scale, motivate private sector technology and private sector capital to get involved in this fight.
So this has been super interesting. I've learned a ton. I know that the audience is enjoying it because you can see some of the comments, but independent of that, there's other things happening that you guys can't see. So I know everybody's appreciating it very much. We've gone over time here, but it's totally fine. Would you love to say anything final, either individually or as a group or whatever you want?
My last comment would simply be, we need more focus. We need to understand the China threat or the Russia threat, yes, but we need more focus on playing a better game so that we who are playing checkers can switch to the three-dimensional chess that others are playing. We're not even playing the same game. So the only way that happens is bringing all sectors of society together, and especially private capital to really drive forward.
Yep.
Great. Anything else?
David?
I concur.
Well, great, Arthur. I want to thank you for this opportunity. Look forward to doing this again. But to me, this is fun, but it's also important. Just a bit of kind of importance, I think, on this. I think we've all shared is this is something I think we need to get everyone involved with. I think there's a lot to be gained financially for doing this right in terms of getting family offices and private capital involved in this space. But I think we're at a point now where there is going to be some tremendous disruptions that are going to happen, both positive and negative, because of the advancements of technology and because of what's happening geopolitically. And I think the families and the investors that are positioned right to do this and take advantage of deal flow are going to be in a position where they're going to be able to reap the rewards, but also realize that there's a bit of social impact investment happening here. So social impact investment has always been more on the altruistic side, but here's a real live example where I think there is opportunities for investors to put money to work in venture, specifically around national security and defense, realize a very, very strong return on that investment, but also a sense of return on mission because you're investing in technologies that make a difference. If you believe in our capitalistic system, if you believe in Western values, and this is something you want to maintain in the 21st century, then this becomes, I think, a critical rallying point where I think we need to get government, venture, and tech to as David has said it before, rowing in the same direction. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. I think I saw a couple of people of posts if people want to reach out to us. Arthur, by all means, they can reach out to us through either you or all three of us are on LinkedIn. So glad to chat. Appreciate the opportunity and thank you for your support here today.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks so much. Super grateful for knowing you, Hamlet, and meeting you folks here for the first time, Carl and David, and for the community spending the only thing they can't make more of their time with us this afternoon. And we will definitely be giving you all the contact information so you can have a heads up if somebody wants to contact you. And signing off for now. Thank you very, very much for everybody once again. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.